Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Rise of American Democracy, Jefferson to Lincoln, by Sean Wilentz, narrated by Joe Barrett. Preface. This book's simple title describes the historical arc of its subject. Important elements of democracy existed in the infant American Republic of the 1780s, but the Republic was not democratic, nor in the minds of those who governed it was it supposed to be. A republic, the res publica, or public thing, was meant to secure the common good through the ministrations of the most worthy, enlightened men. A democracy derived from demos kratio, rule of the people, dangerously handed power to the impassioned, unenlightened masses. Democracy, the eminent Federalist political leader George Cabot wrote as late as 1804, was the government of the worst. Yet by the 1830s, as Alexis de Tocqueville learned, most Americans proclaimed that their country was a democracy as well as a republic. Enduring arguments had begun over the boundaries of democratic politics. In the 1840s and 1850s, these arguments centered increasingly on slavery and slavery's expansion and led to the Civil War. The changes were astonishing, but neither inevitable nor providential. American democracy did not rise like the sun at its natural hour in history. Its often troubled ascent was the outcome of human conflicts, accommodations, and unforeseen events, and the results could well have been very different than they were. The difficulties and the contingencies made the events all the more remarkable. A momentous rupture occurred between Thomas Jefferson's time and Abraham Lincoln's that created the lineaments of modern democratic politics. The rise of American democracy is the story of that rupture and its immediate consequences. Democracy is a troublesome word, and explaining why is one of my book's goals. A decade before the American Revolution, the early patriot James Otis defined democracy in its purest and simplest form as a government of all over all, in which the votes of the majority shall be taken as the voice of the whole, and where the rulers were the ruled. As fixed descriptions go, this is as good as any, but its abstractness, of course, begs explication. Since the Revolution, citizens, scholars, and political leaders have latched onto one or another aspect of government or politics as democracy's essence. For some, it is a matter of widened political rights, usually measured by the extent of the suffrage and actual voting. For others, democracy means greater opportunity for the individual pursuit of happiness. For still others, it is more a cultural phenomenon than a political one, a habit of the heart, as de Tocqueville put it, in which deference to rulers and condescension for the ruled give way to the ruder conventions of equality. All these facets are important, but I think we go astray in discussing democracy simply as a form of government or society, or as a set of social norms, a category or a thing with particular structures that can be codified and measured. Today, democracy in America means enfranchisement, at a minimum, of the entire adult citizenry. By that standard, the American democracy of the mid-19th century was hardly a democracy at all. Women of all classes and colors lacked political and civil rights. Most blacks were enslaved. Free black men found political rights they had once enjoyed either reduced or eliminated. The remnant of a ravaged Indian population in the eastern states had been forced to move west without citizenship. Even the most expansive of the era's successful democratic political reforms encompassed considerably less than half of the total adult population, and at best a bare majority of the free adult citizenry. But to impose current categories of democracy on the past is to block any understanding of how our own, more elevated standards originated. It is to distort the lives of Americans who could barely have anticipated political and social changes that we take for granted. It is to substitute our experiences and prejudices for theirs. By democracy, I mean a historical fact rooted in a vast array of events and experiences that comes into being out of changing human relations between governors and the governed. Stopping history cold at any particular point and parsing its political makeup negates that historical flow and stifles the voices and activities of actual people attempting to define the operations of government. Only over an extended period of time is it possible to see democracy and democratic government grow out of particular social, intellectual, and political contexts. Democracy appears when some large number of previously excluded ordinary persons, what the 18th century called the many, secure the power not simply to select their governors, but to oversee the institutions of government, as office holders and as citizens free to assemble and criticize those in office. Democracy is never a gift bestowed by benevolent, far-seeing rulers who seek to reinforce their own legitimacy. It must always be fought for by political coalitions that cut across distinctions of wealth, power, and interest. It succeeds and survives only when it is rooted in the lives and expectations of its citizens and continually reinvigorated in each generation. Democratic successes are never irreversible. Since de Tocqueville, there has been a long tradition of scholarship devoted to understanding the democratic rupture that this book describes. The rise of American democracy engaged the attention of great historians, now forgotten by the general reading public, Dixon Ryan Fox, J. Franklin Jameson, as well as such acknowledged giants as Henry Adams, Charles and Mary Beard, Frederick Jackson Turner, Richard Hofstadter, and most recently Gordon S. Wood. But modern study of the subject owes the most to Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr.'s Age of Jackson, published in 1945. Before Schlesinger, historians thought of American democracy as the product of an almost mystical frontier or agrarian egalitarianism. The Age of Jackson toppled that interpretation by placing democracy's origins firmly in the context of the founding generation's ideas about the few and the many, and by seeing democracy's expansion as an outcome of struggles between classes, not sections. More than any previous account, Schlesinger's examined the activities and ideas of obscure ordinary Americans as well as towering political leaders. While he identified most of the key political events and changes of the era, Schlesinger also located the origins of modern liberal politics in the tradition of Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson, and in their belief, as he wrote, that future challenges will best be met by a society in which no single group is able to sacrifice democracy and liberty to its interests. Finally, Schlesinger examined and emphasized the shattering moral and political dilemmas that an expanding Southern slavery posed to American democracy, leading to the Civil War. Since the Age of Jackson appeared, a revolution in historical studies has focused scholars' attentions on groups of Americans and aspects of American history that held minor interest at best in the historical profession in 1945. That revolution has altered historians' views of every detail of our past. The tragedy of Indian removal, the democratic activities of ex-slaves and other free blacks, and the political impact of slaves' resistance, the ease and sometimes the viciousness with which some professed Democrats, North and South, championed white racial supremacy, their participation of women in reform efforts and in time in electoral campaigns, along with the ridicule directed at the fledgling woman suffrage movement, the liberal humanitarian impulses of supposedly conservative pro-business politics, the importance of ethnicity and religion in shaping Americans' political allegiances. Each of these, either ignored or slighted 60 years ago, has generated its own scholarly literature. Yet if the social history revolution has profoundly changed how historians look at the United States, it has not diminished the importance of the questions the Age of Jackson asked about early American democracy. On the contrary, it has made those questions, especially about democratic politics, social class, and slavery, all the more pertinent to our understanding of the dramatic events that led from the American Revolution to the American Civil War. Some important recent works have attempted to raise those questions anew and combine the so-called new style of history with the older. The most ambitious of them have reinterpreted the connections between society and politics before 1860 as part of a larger market revolution that swept across the country. But these admirable studies have generally submerged the history of politics in the history of social change, reducing politics and democracy to byproducts of various social forces without quite allowing the play of politics its importance. The rise of American democracy offers a different interpretation, with a greater emphasis on the vagaries of politics, high and low. The subtitle, Jefferson to Lincoln, reaffirms the importance of political events, ideas, and leaders to democracy's rise, once an all too prevalent assumption, now in need of some rescue and repair. Thomas Jefferson, more than any other figure in the early republic, established, and was seen to have established, the terms of American democratic politics. Abraham Lincoln self-consciously advanced an updated version of Jefferson's egalitarian ideals, and his election to the presidency of the United States caused the greatest crisis American democracy has yet known. By singling out Jefferson and Lincoln, I certainly do not mean to say that presidents and other great men were solely responsible for the vicissitudes of American politics. One of the book's recurring themes is how ordinary Americans, including some beyond the uttermost reaches of the country's formal political life, had lasting influence on the exercise of power. But just as political leaders did not create American democracy out of thin air, so the masses of Americans did not simply force their way into the corridors of power. That Jefferson and not John Adams was elected president in 1800-01, a fact that nearly did not come to pass, made a great difference to later political developments. So did the presence of other public officials, elected and unelected, from the top of American public life to the bottom. Featuring Jefferson and Lincoln in the subtitle is a shorthand way of insisting on what ought to be a truism, that some individuals have more influence on history than others. The title, by referring to a broader history, insists that they cannot make history just as they please, constrained as they are by a host of forces, persons, and popular movements beyond their control and anticipation. The book can be listened to as a chronicle of American politics from the Revolution to the Civil War, with the history of democracy at its center, or as an account of how democracy arose in the United States and with what consequences in the context of its time. Either way, the book has a few major themes. One, given special attention in the opening chapters, is that democracy, at the nation's inception, was highly contested, not a given, and developed piecemeal by fits and starts at the state and local as well as the national level. A second theme is that social changes barely foreseen in 1787, the rapid commercialization of the free labor North and the renaissance of plantation slavery in the South, deeply affected how democracy advanced and retreated after 1815. Third, Americans perceived these social changes primarily in political terms and increasingly saw them as struggles over contending ideas of democracy. Americans of the early 19th century lived in a different mental universe from ours with regard to politics. Above all, they inherited from the Revolutionary era a Republican perspective that regarded political institutions as the foundation of social and economic relations, and not the other way around. Certain kinds of societies appeared more conducive than others to a just and harmonious government. Americans sharply disagreed about which societies were superior, but if order and happiness abounded, they believed it was because political institutions and the men running them were sound. Disorder and unhappiness stemmed from unsound institutions or from the corruption of sound institutions by ambitious and designing men. Across the chasm of the Civil War, the era of high industrialism, and the conflicts of the 20th century, we are more likely to see economic power and interests as the matrix for politics and political institutions. For Americans of the early republic, politics, government, and constitutional order, not economics, were primary to interpreting the world and who ran it, a way of thinking that can wrongly look simplified, paranoid, and conspiracy-driven today. A fourth theme concerns the constancy of political conflict. Democracy in America was the spectacle of Americans arguing over democracy. If the word became a shibboleth for new and emerging political parties and movements, it did not on that account become degraded and bland. Precisely because opposing groups claimed to champion the same ideal, they fought all the harder to ensure their version would prevail. There was no end to the possible qualifying labels Americans could devise to illustrate exactly what sort of Democrats they were, not just with separate major and third-party labels, Democratic, Whig, states' rights, know-nothing, and so on, but with a blizzard of names for factions within the parties that always bemuse uninitiated readers: Locofoco, Barnburner, Hunker, Silver Gray. In part, these labels connoted patronage connections for political insiders, but in an age when elections came to be conducted more or less year-round, they also reflected beliefs and deep commitments above and beyond partisan machinations, while for a radical such as William Lloyd Garrison they were craven and sinful, and for a corrosive skeptic such as Herman Melville they inspired ambivalence and dread. Fifth, the many-sided conflicts over American democracy came in the 1840s and 1850s to focus on an issue of recognized importance since the Republic's birth: the fate of American slavery. Throughout the decades after the Revolution, but with a hurling force after 1840, two American democracies emerged: the free labor democracy of the North and the slaveholders' democracy of the South, distinct political systems as well as bodies of thought. Although they often praised identical values and ideals, and although they were linked through the federal government and the national political parties, the two were fundamentally antagonistic. The nation's political leaders suppressed those antagonisms, sometimes in the face of powerful protests and schismatic movements, from the 1820s through the early 1850s. By 1860, the conflict could no longer be contained, as a Democratic election sparked Southern secession and the war that would determine American democracy's future. The book's final theme is implied in the others. The idea of democracy is never sufficient unto itself. Since the Second World War, and even more since the great democratic revolutions of 1989 to 91, the world has witnessed the continuing resilience and power of democratic ideals. So swiftly have former tyrannies turned into self-declared democratic governments that the danger has arisen of taking democracy for granted, despite its manifest fragility and possible collapse in large parts of the globe. As the early history of the United States shows, the habits and the institutions of modern democracy are relatively new in the larger span of history. Their breakthrough, even in the most egalitarian portions of the New World, required enormous reversals of traditional assumptions about power and legitimacy. As those habits and institutions began taking hold, different American social orders produced clashing versions of democracy, generating enmities so deep that they could only be settled in blood. Thereafter, democratic ideas both in the United States and elsewhere have had to be refreshed, fought over, and redefined continually. The rise of American democracy from Jefferson's era to Lincoln's created exhilarating new hopes and prospects, but also fierce conflicts and enormous challenges about what democracy can be and should be. Democracy's hopes and prospects, its conflicts and challenges, persist. So do its vulnerabilities. Prologue. On pleasant evenings in the middle of the 1830s, Noah Webster, nearing his 80s, would return home from his daily walk around New Haven, sit in his front porch rocker, pick up his newspaper, and moan. The latest political dispatches told Webster that the republic he had loved and fought for had gone to the devil, a democratic devil in the shape of Andrew Jackson, and the future looked bleak. Webster's wife, upon hearing his sighs, knew what was coming: a monologue on mob rule, the death of Christian virtue, and the savagery of strange doctrines and slogans: rotation on office, the rich oppress the poor, the spoils belong to the victors, that had taken the country by storm. Later in the evening, a few of Webster's professor friends from Yale might stop by to listen and nod their heads, forming a mutually admiring circle of dyspeptic, learned men. On these occasions, Webster would brighten momentarily. But many of his companions, like himself, had grown old, and the number of Americans like them was too small, Webster feared, to save the republic now. When the professors did not appear, Webster would rouse himself, scratch down his opinions, and mail them to a few agreeable editors and elected officials. He was still a well-known figure, a veteran political controversialist, die-hard nationalist and self-made man, a founding father of sorts. Although the great dictionary he had published years earlier had not found its market, his blue-backed speller had been a rousing success, and trustworthy critics had hailed him as the man who had literally defined the American language. Perhaps his countrymen would heed his wisdom after all, and so he composed his didactic letters denouncing President Jackson and Jackson's fanatical democratic principles. Webster devised a plan to check the egalitarian tide by raising the voting age to 45, dividing the electorate into two classes according to age and wealth, and letting each class choose one House of Congress, an Americanized gerontocratic version of the British Lords and Commons. But his ideas impressed few readers and caused many to snicker, and the old man sank into acrid reveries about his days as a boy soldier during the American Revolution. Had he foreseen what would follow, he told an associate, he never would have enlisted in the patriot cause. Webster was a political relic in the 1830s, yet around the country other Americans were also pessimistic. In the summer of 1837, James Kent, the nation's most distinguished legal commentator, journeyed to the spa at Saratoga Springs and joined other gentlemen in discussing the destructiveness of what Kent called the democracy of numbers and radicalism. In Manhattan, the affluent parvenu and former mayor of New York, Philip Hone, recoiled with horror from the unkempt Jacksonian supporters who ran wild in the streets on election days, and who on one dismal occasion besieged him in his own house with catcalls. Further south, slave-holding planters and office-holders who thought Jackson a turncoat despaired at his popularity with the plain people and voters. "The old warrior chief has kicked up a hell of a dust throughout the nation," a Tennessean wrote to a North Carolina planter in 1834, adding that while most of our friends of North Carolina are against Jackson's experiments, I should suppose that the people of the state were for him. Other Southerners despaired that the masses of farmers and the anti-Jacksonians were like aliens in blood. Jackson's critics were prone to see the sum of the new democratic order in the president's craggy face and in what Kent called the horrible doctrine and influence of Jacksonism. But men with longer experience, such as Noah Webster, knew there was more to it than that. For Webster, Jackson was a reborn Thomas Jefferson, accomplishing what Jefferson had only imagined accomplishing when the philosophizing mood was upon him. Jackson himself, not known for philosophizing, called his political beliefs an extension of good old Jeffersonian democratic republican principles. And if Jackson came to symbolize a fulfillment of Jeffersonian desires, his path had been cleared long before he took office. The kind of political charisma, and for many scariness, he emanated could not have been produced by his military glory and personal fortitude alone. For more than half a century, Americans of all persuasions had been preparing the way for Jackson or some Democratic leader like him. The mysterious rise of American democracy was an extraordinary part of the most profound political transformation in modern history, the triumph of popular government, and of the proposition, if not fully the reality, that sovereignty rightly belongs to the mass of ordinary, individual, and equal citizens. For centuries throughout the Western world, such political arrangements had seemed utterly unnatural. Since Plato, doctrines of hierarchical authority had dominated political thought, whether classical, favoring the rule of the wise, Christian, favoring the rule of the holy, or some mixture of the two. According to these doctrines, most of humanity was unsuited for public duties more elevated than the drudgery of farm animals. History seemed to support hierarchical theory. The fate of popular government in the ancient Greek city-states and the Roman Republic had been tragic. Periodic peasant uprisings and urban disorders from the late 14th century on persuaded the articulate classes of Britain and Europe that the people were dangerously unstable and incapable of rational thought. The beast, the rabble, the idiot multitude reappeared with contemptuous regularity in the learned treatises, poems, and plays of the early modern West. Rebellion, civil war, and regicide in England after 1640 set the beast stirring, allied as never before, albeit testily, with its social betters among the Puritan and parliamentarian insurgents. Entrenched inside Oliver Cromwell's army and in the London trades, the hobnails, clouted shoes, the private soldiers, the leather and woolen aprons, the preacher and radical hero John Lilburne said, so-called leveller agitators proposed not simply the abolition of the monarchy and the House of Lords, but the establishment of a government truly representative of the people, based on an equitably distributed franchise. In smaller pockets of rebellion, more outlandish plebeian prophets, ranters, diggers, seekers announced diverse visions of communal heavens on earth. But the revolution's leaders kept radical dissenters on the political margins. At the famous army debates at Putney in 1647, Cromwell and his lieutenants squelched any possibility of popular suffrage. Over the ensuing chaotic decade, the propertied and educated few closed ranks against the unreasonable many. With the restoration of the English monarchy in 1660, plebeian radical politics plunged underground, to reappear sporadically in conspiracies, riots, and revels over the century to come. When democracy broke through again in the 1770s, it was in the New World, not the Old, as a beleaguered force within the American Revolution. The combustion was not spontaneous. Even before the outbreak of the English Civil War, religious sectarians who preferred flight to New England to life under Tudor monarchy established at least a nominal conception of self-rule by compact, to which some dissenters, such as a group of 4 Rhode Island towns in 1647, attached the word democracy. In 1644, the schismatic Roger Williams declared that the sovereign, original, and foundation of civil power lies in the people. Bits and pieces of the English plebeian radicalism of the 1640s and 1650s crossed the Atlantic and survived to help inspire the American revolutionaries and frighten their opponents over a century later. As the independence struggle with Britain reached a crisis in 1774, the more radical of the Massachusetts towns excoriated George III for aspiring, as the selectmen of Billerica put it, to the unlimited prerogative contended for by those arbitrary and misguided princes Charles I and James II, for which one lost his life and the other his kingdom. The most popular anti-monarchical pamphlet of the Revolution, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, contained numerous allusions to old English democratic themes. The radicalism of the 17th century belongs to the genealogy of American democracy, and there were important differences between the colonies and the mother country in political practice. Colonial charters installed property requirements for voting, usually landed freeholds, but in newly settled colonial areas where land was cheap, anywhere from 70 to 80% of white adult men could meet the qualification. It was far easier for an American man of middling means than for his British counterpart to hold local and even legislative office. The colonies lacked Britain's incrustation of civil bureaucracies, church sinecures, and military commands. Americans' experience of town meetings, where in New England humble men won election to local offices, and of independent parish-run dissenting churches, gave them a strong taste for direct political engagement. Some British visitors and American royalists regarded the colonies as wild egalitarian outposts. A writer in Rivington's New York Loyal Gazette flatly blamed the Revolution on the Americans' democratic form of government. Some later historians, with no royalist motives, have even described 18th century America as a middle-class democracy long before the Revolution. Yet the evidence of colonial democracy, and especially the differences with Britain, can be highly deceiving. In older, settled rural areas of the colonies, as in coastal towns and early cities, the proportion of eligible voters among white men was much smaller than elsewhere, as little as 2 in 5. Those proportions probably declined during the years immediately preceding the Revolution, when the rate of property ownership in the colonies was falling. The famous town-meeting democracies of New England were often run as means to ratify decisions already made by local leaders and to give the air of amicable consensus. In the mid-18th century, more than previously, the British monarchy was the wellspring of American political authority, the bestower of favor and fortune through royal appointment to the competing interests or connections of America's premier gentry families. Within this monarchical setting, rival families or factions might mobilize ordinary voters on election days through treats or barbecues or more raucous, even violent gatherings, but the royalist favorites always remained in charge. Outside elections, the everyday gulf between noble patricians and the beast-like people was deep, even among those fortunate men who had risen out of the rabble. No less than the established grandees, up-and-coming patriot leaders respected elaborate codes of social deference. The young George Washington beheld the lesser farmers of
Sample complete. Ready to continue?